Today we're going to be unpacking a really powerful and, honestly, provocative text. It's called the Gospel of Delineation, and it's actually written like a sermon. So what we're going to do is break down its main arguments, look at its justifications, and see what its final call to action is, just to really understand the worldview it's presenting.
Right from the jump, the source material hits you with this incredibly assertive line. It just immediately sets this firm, completely unapologetic tone. This isn't a request for understanding, it's a flat-out declaration. So right away, it makes you wonder, what exactly is being confirmed here?
Well, the entire argument is built around this one core concept, delineation. And as the source defines it, this is a political act. It's about drawing a very sharp, very clear line to separate the identity of foundational Black Americans from bigger, broader labels like Black or Pan-African. So let's dig into why that distinction is so critical to its whole message.
And that brings us to the first major argument, which is captured in this one simple but really profound phrase: we are not the same. The entire ideology rests on this foundation, this idea that there's a historical experience so unique it just can't be merged with any other.
So how does it make that case? Well, this quote right here just crystallizes the whole argument. It creates this stark, unavoidable contrast between two very different American origin stories. You've got the story of voluntary immigration, symbolized by Ellis Island, and then you have the story of forced bondage, symbolized by the auction block. The source is arguing these are just fundamentally different starting points, two separate worlds.
And here, that contrast gets broken down even further. The source frames the immigrant story as an arrival, a story of choice, of seeking something better. But in direct opposition, you have the foundational story, which it calls a crucifixion, a narrative defined by being imported as cargo, by suffering. The language here, it's clearly designed to present these two narratives as completely irreconcilable.
Now, the text knows this might sound divisive, so it gets ahead of that criticism. It tries to reframe its own purpose. It says, look, this isn't about hate, it's about historical clarity. It's not trying to create division, it's trying to establish a clear definition. And it's not tribalism, it's a tribunal, like a call for justice based on a very specific historical case.
Okay, so how does the source justify this kind of separation? It does it by using this really powerful, almost religious language to lay out its reasoning. It frames the whole thing as the law of lineage. And central to this whole idea of lineage is the concept of a covenant. Now, in this context, it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for an exclusive identity that you inherit. It suggests this special agreement, this specific claim that you can't just join or choose to be a part of. According to the text, it's simple. You had to be born into it. So what makes up this covenant? Well, the source outlines these four pillars that kind of build on each other. It all starts with what it calls a name from God, a distinct identity. This is then tied to a wound from history, a totally unique kind of suffering. And that suffering creates blood from the soil, a direct ancestral connection to American land through that bondage. And according to the text, these first three pillars all lead to the fourth one, an inheritance to protect, a specific claim, like reparations, that belongs only to this lineage.
Now, if there's an exclusive inheritance that you have to protect, the text argues there must also be a threat. And this next section identifies that perceived threat, again using another one of these powerful religious metaphors. We bear imitation saints.
So that leads to a pretty direct question. Who exactly are these so-called imitation saints? Well, according to the source material, these are people or groups who are accused of adopting the language, the symbols, and the struggle of foundational Black Americans, but without sharing that specific historical lineage and that specific wound.
And the text gives a couple of examples of what it calls this imitation. The first one points to what it sees as a kind of conditional solidarity. The argument here is that this inclusive identity of we're all Black can, suddenly disappear during a direct confrontation with systemic issues like policing.
The second example points to tangible benefits. The text argues that the mantra of we're all one can vanish the moment official classifications, like the ones on a job application, come into play. The source portrays this as a sort of strategic use of identity by those it considers to be outside of the core lineage.
And all of this builds up to one of the text's most powerful statements. The argument here is that foundational Black Americans aren't just another category to be checked on some form. No,
Their foundational experience in America is what actually created the racial and social categories, the boxes, that define the entire system today.
So, after defining the identity, justifying the claim, and identifying the threat, the sermon moves toward its conclusion. And it's a direct, unambiguous call to action for its audience. Stand on the bloodline.
This call to action is really rooted in three core principles that we've seen woven throughout the entire text. First, that holiness, or the purity of this specific identity, requires separation. Second, that real justice demands traceability. You need a direct line from the harm to the person making the claim. And third, that a legacy born from such a specific suffering is not and cannot be owed to everyone.
And here it is, the final charge. The act of delineation is framed not as an act of aggression, but as an act of self-preservation. It's presented as a decolonizing act, protecting a unique identity from being absorbed or diluted or co-opted by anyone else.
So all of this leaves us with a final and pretty provocative question. The Gospel of Delineation presents one very clear, very powerful answer, but it raises a much larger challenge that's worth thinking about. How does any group define its own story when history is a shared space, but the wounds aren't?